Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're journeying back in time to the Middle Ages. Now when you picture this era, what comes to mind? Knights in shining armor, towering castles, and vast sprawling farmlands, right? For a long time, that was the reality. Society was overwhelmingly rural, built around the feudal system. Lords owned the land, and serfs worked it in exchange for protection and a place to live. Life was tied to the soil, and for most people, the world was no bigger than their own village and the next. But then something started to change. A quiet revolution began to bubble up, one that would reshape the landscape of Europe forever. This wasn't a revolution of swords and shields, but one of trade, craft, and community. This is the story of the rise of towns. So, how did this massive shift happen? It wasn't a single event, but a slow burn fueled by several key factors. First, let's talk about food. Around the 10th and 11th centuries, European agriculture got a major upgrade. New technologies like the heavy plow, which could turn over the dense, clay-rich soil of Northern Europe, and the horse collar, which let horses pull plows faster and more efficiently than oxen, made farming much more productive. Add to that the three-field system of crop rotation, and suddenly farmers were producing more food than they needed just to survive. This agricultural surplus was a game changer. For the first time in centuries, a significant portion of the population didn't have to be farmers. They were free to do other things, to specialize in other skills. With more food and a growing population, people started to move. Some were serfs who had earned or bought their freedom. Others were younger sons who wouldn't inherit the family land. They were all looking for new opportunities, and they found them at the crossroads of the old world. These were places where major roads met, where rivers could be crossed, or near fortified castles and monasteries that offered protection. These strategic locations naturally became hubs of activity. Merchants and pilgrims would stop to rest, and locals would come to sell their surplus grain or livestock. Slowly but surely, these informal gathering spots began to grow into something more permanent. Merchants were the lifeblood of these new settlements. As long-distance trade routes, some dormant since the Roman Empire, began to reopen. Goods from far-off lands started to flow back into Europe. Spices, silks, and other luxuries from the East were in high demand. Traveling merchants formed caravans for protection and journeyed from place to place, setting up temporary markets and fairs. The most successful of these fairs became annual events, drawing huge crowds and vast amounts of money. Eventually, merchants realized it was more practical to settle down in one of these bustling locations rather than constantly being on the road. They built permanent storehouses and homes, and around them, the towns began to take shape. But it wasn't just merchants. Remember those people freed from farming? They became the artisans and craftsmen. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, bakers, shoemakers, you name it. They flocked to these new urban centers, where there were customers with money to spend. Instead of making goods just for a local lord, they were producing for a wider market. This created a new kind of economy, one based not on land, but on commerce and craft. To protect their interests and ensure quality standards, these craftsmen organized themselves into guilds. A guild was like a combination of a trade union, a professional association, and a social club. Each craft had its own guild. The Weavers' Guild, the Masons' Guild, the Goldsmiths' Guild. They were incredibly powerful. Guilds controlled almost every aspect of a particular trade within a town. They set prices for goods, regulated working hours, and determined who could become a master craftsman. To join a trade, a young boy would start as an apprentice, living with a master craftsman for years to learn the skills. After his apprenticeship, he became a journeyman, traveling and working for other masters to hone his craft. The final step was to create a masterpiece to prove his skill to the guild. If it was accepted, he could become a master himself, open his own shop, and take on apprentices. This system ensured high-quality products and provided a clear career path for urban workers, something that simply didn't exist in the feudal countryside. As these towns grew in wealth and population, they started to clash with the old feudal order. Most of this land was still technically owned by a local lord or a bishop. These feudal lords wanted to tax the townsfolk and control their affairs, just as they controlled the serfs on their manors. But the townspeople, or burghers as they were called, had different ideas. They were merchants and craftsmen, not farmers. They valued freedom, trade, and self-governance. They began to pool their resources and demand more autonomy. They wanted the right to govern themselves, to have their own courts, and to control their own taxes. This led to a fascinating power struggle. In some cases, towns literally bought their freedom. The burghers would collect a large sum of money and offer it to the king or lord in exchange for a charter. A town charter was a legal document that granted the town specific rights and privileges, essentially making it a self-governing entity. Other times, towns had to fight for their independence, leading to revolts and conflicts. The famous phrase Stadtluft macht frei, meaning city air makes you free, comes from this period. According to a new law, if a serf could escape to a town and live there for a year and a day without being caught by their lord, they were legally free. This made towns powerful magnets for people seeking to escape the bonds of feudalism. So what was life actually like in a medieval town? Forget the romanticized images. It was crowded, noisy, and frankly, pretty smelly. The streets were narrow, winding, and unpaved. There was no sanitation system to speak of, so people threw their garbage and waste right out into the street. Animals like pigs, geese, and chickens roamed freely, adding to the mess. The houses were built of wood and plaster, packed tightly together, making fire a constant and terrifying danger. A single spark could burn down an entire neighborhood in hours. Disease was also rampant in these cramped, unsanitary conditions. The Black Death in the 14th century, for example, hit urban centers incredibly hard because the plague spread so easily from person to person. Despite these harsh realities, towns were also vibrant and exciting places. The marketplace was the heart of the town, a chaotic and colorful scene filled with merchants hawking their wares, farmers selling produce, and entertainers juggling or playing music. The church or cathedral was the town's focal point, not just for religious services, but for community gatherings and civic pride. The construction of a grand cathedral could take centuries, involving the entire community and showcasing the town's wealth and piety. Life was lived publicly in the streets and squares. There was a sense of shared identity and purpose among the townspeople that was very different from the isolation of rural life. The rise of towns had a profound and lasting impact on European civilization. They were the engines of economic growth, fostering trade, innovation, and the birth of a new middle class, the bourgeoisie. They were also centers of learning and culture. The first universities, like those in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, grew up in towns independent of the church's direct control. This new intellectual environment challenged old ways of thinking and paved the way for the Renaissance. Politically, the self-governing towns broke the absolute power of the feudal lords. Kings often allied with the towns against the nobility, centralizing their own power and laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state. In essence, the rise of towns marked the beginning of the end for the Middle Ages. It was a slow but irreversible shift from a rural, land-based society to an urban, commercial one. These noisy, crowded, and dynamic centers of trade and freedom were the crucibles where the modern world was forged. They created new social structures, new forms of government, and a new way of thinking about the world and one's place in it. The legacy of these medieval towns is all around us today, in our cities, our economies, and our very ideas of liberty and community. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story of medieval urban life fascinating, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments which historical topic you'd like to explore next. Until then, stay curious.